but like the word is out and the time is up. If you don't get behind accountability and responsible sourcing, your consumer base will continue to shrink.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. I'm beyond stoked to share with you this chat that I had with Adam Bent, the co-founder of Scout Canning, which is on a mission to become the most trusted seafood brand in North America. This episode is so good. I can't wait for you all to listen. We cover all sorts of topics, from environmental responsibility versus sustainability, the role of third-party certifications, the current debate around B Corp status, and how to become a more environmentally responsible seafood shopper. I also want to commend Scout on some news that broke after we recorded. In honor of its official B Corp certification coming through, they formed a partnership with Raven Trust, Canada's only NGO working with Indigenous nations to defend their rights with access to the courts by raising legal defense funds. Scout is truly a special brand that is working to transform our food systems. I hope you enjoy this chat with Adam. Adam, maybe if we can start a little bit about your background, how you came to be involved with Scout, and kind of why you chose to pursue a tinned fish company.
It began, I guess, at the beginning of my entrepreneurial journey right out of high school. Kind of got thrown into the travel industry, building out a travel brand, and just sense of adventure, wanted to be outside, wanted to experience new things, and got the opportunity to work in a bunch of different countries and build out that company from a pretty early age, and forgoed going to university or college to jump right into building startups. Wore a lot of hats, and as that evolved and became a bigger company, by the time that I left, at that point, I had developed a pretty keen interest in food and climate action and the environment were all kind of personal passions, but hadn't been able to necessarily translate them over to my work life just yet. So as I was transitioning kind of from the travel industry and the startups that I was building there, I got thrown into managing the rollout for Urban Spoon in the Canadian market. I'm not sure if folks will remember Urban Spoon, but it was a pretty well-known and highly downloaded app for some time, and basically building food community and giving consumers access to filtering and selecting really great restaurants and the places that they're living or traveling. So spent a lot of time building out our hospitality network and media partners within food, and growing out the platform within the Canadian market. And that's actually how I stumbled into this idea that chefs were becoming very influential with how consumers were shopping for food at home. So making kale cool is a really good example, right, of how the hospitality industry can popularize these like underloved or underrepresented ingredients or species, and how that kind of trickles down to how consumers end up shopping or what even really influence their dietary preferences. And that's where my current co-founder within Scout and I had met, Charlotte Langley, and she was cooking a beautiful seafood dish on Mother's Day way back when, and we hit it off and became friends. And I went in to kind of build other companies after that, primarily within food systems and technology, and a lot of the brand world as well, and direct to consumer. And Charlotte had been building Scout as a side project between 2014 and 2018 as a kind of extension of her personal brand as a chef, and really recognized that consumers had this super high intimidation factor of cooking seafood at home. So they love eating seafood at restaurants, and they probably cook shrimp and salmon at home. But outside of that, not really a lot going on, because they're worried about making a mistake or it not tasting good, or how do I clean, cut, and prepare this particular piece of seafood. So the brand developed kind of a cult following. It was very small scale and artisan for those first couple of years. And I had been friends with Charlotte for well over 12 years, and decided, she was getting to a point where she wanted to figure out that next stage of growth. And I was, looking for my next kind of entrepreneurial endeavor. And when I looked at the seafood category, and looked at consumer products within seafood consumer brands, I recognized like the brands that serve the category, I'm not sure if I'm able to mention them here, but we can think of the big ones in the space. Even a brand like Wild Planet, I mean, a lot of them were pretty disconnected from ocean health and climate action, did very little to connect consumers back to anything going on with our oceans and waterways, or really our oceans as a food producing system and what that actually means. And then coupled with Charlotte's vision and having that kind of small scale artisan brand that she'd been developing, it was kind of like worlds colliding of things that were interesting, a big white space in the category that was made up of really large brands kind of fucking the ocean up. And it was an opportunity for us to create a really great, meaningful brand in the space that folks could trust and really want to get behind.
And so maybe can you unpack a little bit about sort of the differences, especially from an environmental perspective, on a product like what Scout has, where, you know, it's a very premium product, but it is packaged and tinned, which, you know, some people might not necessarily associate immediately with quality, versus like buying a whole sort of chunk of salmon at the grocery store from the fish counter. Like, what is the difference in the environmental impact? Why does one maybe make more sense for the other for different applications?
Look, there's a lot of ways to enjoy seafood, and there's fresh, there's frozen, and there's preserved. And preserved could be smoked, preserved could be tinned like what we do. It could be pickled and jarred. There's a lot of really great ways to enjoy seafood. And I mean, there's hundreds of species that we can be consuming from our oceans and waterways. We tend to gravitate towards the same, right? The chicken, beef, and pork equivalent is salmon, tuna, and shrimp of the ocean. And there's this obsession that consumers have, assuming fresh being kind of king as the most, you know, if you can afford it, if you can access it, if you have the accessibility with local retail, great. It's great to have access to fresh fish. Frozen is a great way to enjoy seafood as well, because we're really reducing food waste there. And, you know, we can keep product in stock in our fridges or at the grocery counter for, you know, months, if not years. And then you have preserved seafood, which is really just a different way of preparing seafood. The natural oils and kind of like omegas, fat content, and just the kind of texture of seafood make it a really ideal protein for canning. So we're taking fresh seafood, we're, you know, hand cutting it, we're packing it into those cans with additional ingredients and oil, and then we're cooking it and it's sealed. So really, we're just talking about a preservation process, but the quality of the seafood that's going into the tin is very high. And we all grew up, at least in the US and Canada, really with canned seafood, meaning tuna, right? That's all we know. It's like canned tuna is the ubiquitous product in the category. Everybody grew up eating tuna salad sandwiches. And there's a reason why we had to drown that tuna in mayo. Because it's often overcooked, it's overprocessed, it's been really, really processed down so that it's really just kind of a texture. And that's why we introduce things like mayo and a couple other ingredients to kind of zhuzh it up and bring some life back to the product. And that's where we start to kind of break off in terms of tiers of quality within tinned seafood. So big fans of preserving food in general. We have a lot of people to feed, and being able to extend the shelf life of any nutritionally dense food is really important. So being able to access seafood affordably is super key. And a great way to do that is still through tinned fish. But at the lower end of the spectrum, you have commodity product. Commodity products are often cooked multiple times. You're losing nutritional density there. Often those supply chains are not great. When you look under the hood, a can of tuna should really not cost $2 or less. There's a lot of labor exploitation. There's a lot of fishing going on from overfished populations, or the stock of the species is at risk. So there's a lot of environmental and human rights abuses that take place along the supply chain, where that $1 to $2 tuna can that finally ends up on the Walmart shelf, you know, there's been some pretty egregious things that have happened for it to get there at that price point. Now, we are a more premium brand, but that really is just because of the price point of paying fair wages and accessing seafood from sustainable supply chains, where those species are returning year over year at the same levels of abundance, where it's safe and sustainable to actually continue to harvest from those populations. And you'll notice a difference in quality when you enjoy a more premium seafood product, whether that's from Scout or a European brand versus some of the commodity brands. And the culture of preserving seafood has gone on and continued in a lot of parts of the world, like Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, where tinned seafood is like a piece of Iberian ham or charcuterie or a fine cheese or wine. Really, it's about harvesting and preserving these foods across the seasons to be enjoyed all year round. And seafood is no exception. There's a lot of seasonality there. And preserving it is just a great format to continue to enjoy it.
One of the things you mentioned there, talking about sort of the supply chain and how the product goes from, sea and waterways and ocean onto our plates eventually, and how that all comes together. And I noticed that Scout is MSC certified in particular. And I'm sure some folks that are listening probably saw the Seaspiracy documentary, saw some contention with different certifications and what dolphin safe means versus what MSC means. And there's a recent article here in the UK in the Guardian, people see something like 400 labels on an average grocery store shelf related to, in some way, to sustainability on various food products. So from your perspective as a producer, how do you think about your supply chain, and how do you think about those certifications to help make sure that someone who is, thinking about both the environmental perspective, ocean overfishing, as you mentioned, but also making sure that people are treated equitably along the supply chain? How do you try to ensure that along your supply chain, and what role do those certifications play? And what is your perspective on maybe some folks that say they're not as stringent as they could be?
Yeah, certifications are important when they're used for an accountability framework, and every producer, every brand still needs to have their own set of values, their own criteria for where they're sourcing, do their own analysis, and really do the work to understand your supply chain and have that transparency, and hopefully share all of that back with the customer base that you've built in the community that you're building. But certifications are that first step where we can rely on third-party audits. We can rely on that organization's, sustainability criteria. And it gives you those extra proof points that are valuable at a consumer level when they're making a purchasing decision to help move a product off the shelf and actually purchase. So there is something to be said about, well, take our word for it, right? This is certified sustainable. And let's say Scout just made up our own icon and we slapped it on. And what does that actually mean? It wouldn't mean anything because it's not backed up by any third-party data. We've just invented it and we've created an icon that is essentially greenwashing, telling you that this product is responsible without anything backing it up. So while we have our own criteria and set of values and sourcing criteria at Scout, we rely on these third-party certification bodies for that accountability factor to make sure that we're working in the right direction, and also so that consumers have a third-party opinion about a product actually being responsibly sourced or not. I'm actually more and more hesitant as the years go on to continue to use the word sustainable. We tend to lean in towards responsibly sourced. For anything to be truly sustainable these days, getting real tough to have like a fully sustainable product. That's why we're hearing things like regenerative agriculture and talking about, food systems that can regenerate themselves. And that's actually something that is quite fascinating about our oceans and waterways. They're extremely resilient food systems if they're left alone. We have zero inputs compared to land-based agriculture. You don't need the same irrigation or fertilizers or labor or water use that goes into creating food like we do on land. But to work our way back towards some of these trust building factors with certifications, ultimately, they provide that accountability framework. At Scout, we are a B Corp, which is no easy feat to achieve. We're also 1% for the Planet member, meaning that all of our kind of charitable and nonprofit projects are tracked and validated third-party wise. And then being an MSC partner means that our seafood is fully traceable right down to where it was caught, what vessel, by whom, at what date, all the way through to what docks it landed at, which trucks it traveled on, to the cold storage facility, and then from the cold storage facility to the cannery, and from the cannery to the warehouse to the retailer to your home. And that chain of custody, they call it the COC, is something that allows us to guarantee that we know where your product's coming from and that it was caught from a certified sustainable fishery. And then, of course, we've got the human factor involved when it comes to human rights violations. Right now, all of our seafood is sourced from Canada and the US, where there's a very high labor standard implemented. So guarantee fair wages across the supply chain. So they're important to have. I don't think they're the be all and end all, and a lot of brands kind of hide behind some greenwashing or blue washing when it comes to things like dolphin safe. These are outdated kind of functions of marketing more than they are about real useful certification criteria these days.
Yeah, it's really interesting you talk about that shift from mainly because it's becoming harder and harder to find things that are actually truly sustainable, in terms of whether we're looking at really if we're looking anywhere across the food system to find things that are truly sustainable, at least the way that the practices are being engaged with right now, whether that be farming on the land or sort of ocean agriculture. So do you think we're going to eventually get to a point, because responsibility is, I think, probably more accurate, but it's also much harder to regulate, like what that actually means. And obviously, responsible is going to be implemented in different ways. Do you eventually think it's going to be up to something like a governmental organization that helps stem things like overfishing and make sure that those populations are managed more responsibly, so that way it sort of levels out a little bit of the playing field, and there's not so much onus on these smaller producers to pay a little bit more to make sure that they're coming from more responsible sources?
And there's three components. You've got, then they all kind of feed into this movement, right? You have the upward pressure of consumers who are paying more attention to how their products are made and where they're coming from, and the environmental and social justice involved in getting that product to market, and all that trust and accountability that comes with it. Now, those values then tend to be something that the emerging brands in consumer products can offer, that the big, multinational corporate brands haven't caught up to yet, or aren't really ready to make that transition. And that's where you have this grassroots, more mindful consumer base that's supporting emerging brands who are mission and values driven. And then that's when the all seeing eye of corporate brands start to pick up on, oh, wait a second, if we do the right thing, we're going to be able to sell more. And these smaller brands that are values and mission driven, doing the right thing, that are supported by more mindful consumers, are now taking market share away from us. So we now have to go and start adopting these ESG principles, and actually, take a look at our supply chain and have more accountability, and start to share the stories about all of our corporate governance and the social environmental impact programs that they're implementing. So 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago, you wouldn't see anywhere near the level of interaction that corporate brands are now having when it comes to environmental and social justice within their own supply chains. But like, the word is out and the time is up. If you don't get behind accountability and responsible sourcing, your consumer base will continue to shrink. And the emerging brands will take market share away from you, because they're able to offer products that the more mindful and Gen Z and millennial consumer base trust. So we really need consumers to continue to support emerging brands and apply that pressure and be shopping based on values, because it does create that forcing function for corporate brands to have to adapt. And they do that by either actually smartening up and fixing their supply chains and becoming more responsible, or they go and they just acquire an emerging brand, which is oftentimes easier for them than shifting their entire supply chains around.
Right.
So while that's all happening within the private sector, we also need governments to be implementing more policy. And truthfully, grocery retail and corporate grocery controls a huge portion of, the food supply. And grocery stores have a huge role to play in stepping in and having more robust sourcing policies, being more stringent on the products that they're allowing into their stores based on third-party audits and those supply chains. And becoming more of that intermediary between the brands that are out on shelf and then offering up to consumers what they're looking for. But of course, at a government level, we need policy. We need the fisheries to continue to be regulated and managed. But it's hard, right? If it's something that you look at a global level, 70% of the planet's covered in water. Nobody can fund that level of governance and monitoring to enforce rules across our global oceans. As soon as you're 100 kilometers off the shoreline, you're in open waters. And you need really robust coast guards to protect against illegal fishing, really robust satellite monitoring, onboard monitors and observers that go out on these harvests. You have massive illegal fishing fleets from various countries that will go and dredge coastal waters of other countries that don't have the resources to defend or protect or enforce their own territories. So just given the vastness of the ocean, we need kind of collective cooperation between the UN and many countries coming together to protect the resource that's shared. And it's very different, right, than enforcing policy on land within borders. So it's complicated. There's a lot of nuances that just don't exist in other parts of the world, just given the nature of how open and unregulated our oceans and waterways are.
That's a really interesting point. I think it's much harder to find and penalize the bad actors when there's so much space to cover just logistically. That's really difficult to do. And one thing you mentioned there, talking about sort of large corporates moving into space that was previously occupied by maybe smaller, more values-driven, more purpose-driven brands. Thinking about something like B Corp certification, which you mentioned Scout just got. There's a little bit of controversy recently because Nespresso, the coffee pod maker, achieved B Corp certification, even though their sort of pod recycling program doesn't even reach half of their consumer base in the UK, for example. And so a few of the B Corps, some high profile names came out and sort of said the B Corp certification and sort of standards need to be re-looked at, which kind of leads me to think, and I'd be curious to get your thought on it as a sort of a business owner who's been involved in that certification process. Like, how do we think about making these certifications maybe more progressive and updating them so that way, as the bar gets raised by some of these smaller brands like Scout doing the right thing, that you don't have these large corporates kind of come in and try to take some of that shine from the B Corp certification when maybe the standards aren't quite as high as they were when these sort of originators were achieving that certification. Like, do you have any thoughts around that? Like, is there more that we can be doing to make sure that these B Corp, MSC, other certifications really mean something as the challenges change?
For sure. And that's an awesome point. I mean, as these organizations grow, and as it becomes more culturally relevant, cool, and necessary to share these values and to be more mission driven across any type of company, these certification bodies are never really going to be like flooded with requests from bigger companies and more corporate brands that are likely doing it as a function of marketing more because it's the right thing to do. Right? Let's be honest. Nespresso's doing that because they see marketing value in it, not because somebody woke up one day and had a change of heart that they want to go and fix their entire supply chain. I still want to commend the efforts of bigger brands that are trying to move in the right direction, whether it was fueled by the need for more sales and marketing, or whether there was some change in leadership that decided it was the right direction to go in. It's still a step in the right direction. And going back to my earlier point, it's consumers and emerging brands that have started to force this movement to happen, where they need to start to adapt. As someone who handled the B Corp certification process, of course, with the support of my team, but led that project. I mean, it took us well over a year. There was a ton of reporting and data that went into it. We had to back that up with reports from our supply chain, with financial statements, with traceability documents. And it was not easy. It took a really long time, and the review process was pretty lengthy. So I didn't find that, even though Scout has been, doing it right since day one and being responsible is in our DNA, it was still not an easy achievement to go through that whole process. So I would imagine that a brand as big as Nespresso probably took a couple of years. And it does evaluate all kind of criteria. I mean, there's the environmental side, there's the human rights side, there's, even your employee benefits package internally, access to services. I mean, there's a litany of criteria that allow you to score up to 100, and you only need to achieve 80 to get B Corp status. Even getting 80 is tough. So while Nespresso might have really fallen short on a number of items where they would have really scored low on parts of their supply chain or recyclability or their overall impact, they might have scored really high on like certain offset programs that they're implementing that kind of counterbalance some of the things that they have to catch up on at a corporate level in order to achieve a higher score on some of the other components. So a lot of corporate brands, I think we're going to continue to see achieving B Corp status. And I think a lot of it will also be driven by a lot of their offset programs or their kind of proactive initiatives that are offsetting the negative parts of their own supply chains or businesses internally, so that they have that chance to kind of catch up and level up and fix their internal supply chains.
Yeah, that's really interesting. kind of a catch-22 in a lot of ways, because you want to make sure that the certifications are rigorous and that people have a lot of data and support and evidence that's being provided. But also, even if a rather small brand like Scout, it takes a year to do, to achieve that certification, be able to go through that process, that kind of puts it out of reach of a lot of organizations that might otherwise have access to it, which might lead to it becoming something that's more dominated by larger brands in the future, which might be a good thing, might be a bad thing, but it's definitely something I think is interesting, something to keep an eye on. So kind of going back a little bit more to your product, like for those that want to eat more environmentally responsible when it comes to their seafood, sort of what questions should they be asking, whether they're going to their grocery store and going to the fish counter, or looking at the tinned fish section and trying to decide, well, this one comes from Spain and this one comes from Canada. Like, I know some people have debated the idea of food miles, is how much do they actually matter? But what are some of the questions that you would recommend people look at if they want to eat more environmentally responsible for their seafood?
The golden rule, I would say these days, what I'm encouraging more folks to consider, if you don't recognize the name of the fish or the species, it's probably more responsible for you to consume that particular species.
I like that.
Yeah, there are hundreds, literally hundreds of finfish and shellfish, mollusks, all kinds of oysters and scallops and mussels and clams and all these amazing, really nutritionally dense, high protein species that we can be consuming from the ocean. But because we're just not familiar with them, we don't know really how to cook them at home. It's not something that we see every day on menus. We ignore 95% of what we can be consuming from our most regenerative food producing ecosystem in the world. So there's an encouragement that we always try to put forward here, like just try something new. What salmon tastes like and you know how to cook it, and what shrimp tastes like and you know how to cook it, what tuna tastes like, you know how to cook it. Why not try a rockfish? Maybe try mackerel. Try a butterfish. There's all kinds of species that you can really be enjoying, and they are typically more affordable too than some of these loved species that we eat at higher frequency. So that's a really great place to start, is try something new and be adventurous and ask at your seafood counter, what is local, what's been fished around here, what's coming from our coasts or the closest coast available to you. And then you do have trust and certification. So if something is MSC certified or Monterey Bay Aquarium, certified, or through their Seafood Watch program, or if it's Ocean Wise, there's a number of organizations that either suggest responsible species, or it's truly an audited fishery where it's considered sustainable. So it's a general rule of thumb is good to follow those certifications. Be careful when you're buying farmed product. Not all farm product is created equal. There are phenomenal aquaculture producers out there that are raising really responsible fish, but oftentimes the majority of farms are not. We're using tons of wild caught seafood to feed farmed populations, and the input ratio of wild seafood going into those farms is actually yielding as much protein as we're taking out of them, which is like classic economics. It's not sustainable, right? We're taking more wild caught fish and we're yielding less farm fish that people can eat. So be very, very careful around farm seafood, and a good price often has hidden consequences. So typically the cheaper a farm product is, there's a reason for that. And if it's a more affordable wild caught product, let's maybe, think about the labor factor that went in there. So it's a tough one. You kind of want to trust and put more trust in your more independent seafood counters. So your neighborhood seafood, fishmongers and fish markets tend to just be more values driven and have more strict sourcing. And then following those certification bodies at more corporate grocery channels. And then trying to buy local seafood where and when you can, and try shellfish and try mollusks and, mussels, clams, oysters, and scallops are really great options that don't take any input at all to grow. They're quite tasty. They're very high in protein, and they actually sequester carbon in their shells, and they clean the water around them. So they're a super climate friendly cuisine. And you just kind of got to get over maybe the weird factor if you're not used to eating protein like that.
I came to oysters and clams a little bit late in life, but it's been a fantastic discovery. I think both fresh as tinned. I mean, there's fantastic products, especially over here in the UK, that we get from Spain in particular, that are really, really, really well done. So, thinking big picture about Scout, you have this mission to be the most trusted seafood brand in North America. Talk about by supporting regional fishing communities, reducing food waste, and protecting our oceans and waterways. Part of that we've talked a little bit about with your sourcing and supply chain and these certifications. How do you think about things like communicating and sort of how you build that trust beyond just the product itself with people to be able to see Scout as sort of the go-to place to go for environmentally responsible product when it comes to seafood?
The big part of our brand is storytelling. We want to have taste of place. So where does the seafood come from? Who caught it? How can you cook it? What are the additional ingredients that have gone into it to kind of enhance the seafood and make it less intimidating and more enjoyable for the consumer? So there's kind of the climate environmental lens of our brand platform, and then there's the culinary side of it, and then they intersect. So we tend to talk about issues that many, many, many other seafood brands wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. Like, we talk about oil spills when they happen and what that actually means. We've spoken up in support of our First Nations communities and their Indigenous fishing rights. We've talked about more gender representation and diversity within the seafood industry. We've done campaigns against human trafficking and the labor issues that exist and all the human rights violations within the global seafood trade. So those aren't all feel good, loving stories that people are going to go and smile and feel all warm inside about, but they're really important stories that I think reinforce, like, hey, this is what's going on out there. Pay attention to the brands that you're supporting and who you're purchasing from. Are they helping our fight against climate change, or are they actually contributing to it? So I think that's kind of the basis of that more environmental lens. And we do practice an understanding of intersectional environmentalism, that people and planet are not separate, that the social justice issues are not separate from the environmental issues. So you'll also see us really talking a lot about the humanity and humans within the supply chain and why that's important. And then the importance of, education in how to actually cook and enjoy seafood, and a wider variety of it is another part of our mission. Wanting to encourage biodiversity and seafood consumption by showing that there are these amazing other species that you can enjoy. So while in other parts of the world, in Europe and Asia, seafood is consumed in much, much, much larger quantities than in Canada and the US. In Canada and the US, we tend to just stick to the same species, tuna, salmon, and shrimp being the top three, and then a few other familiar fish from there. But we want to encourage a wider variety of consumption. So we're slowly but surely introducing more and more species and proving, hey, like, you enjoyed our tuna, or you really enjoyed like the decadent lobster, now come and try the trout or try the mussels, and then you can try the crab and you can try the oysters and start to kind of move down the food chain and enjoy species of all kinds. And as a rule of thumb, sometimes the smaller species, not the predatory fish like swordfish or tuna that eat all the smaller fish, are really delicious and often more nutritious, and can be enjoyed. But it's a slow burn where we kind of have to work our way into continuing to build that trust and credibility with consumers. Kind of, tuna is that gateway fish, we can call it, that they know and trust and understand what it's going to taste like. And then once they've experienced that with the Scout brand, then they can go and, hopefully try new species. So yeah, it just comes down to the messaging, right? The stories that we're telling and being transparent about our supply chain, where the products are coming from, what's going on with our oceans and waterways, and why they're important against our fight against climate change. And then also, let's not to forget, like, everybody loves hanging on the beach, swimming, paddling, surfing, sailing, going for hikes and checking out lakes and rivers. And we enjoy so much about being around our oceans and waterways and being on them, but we never really think about it as a food producing ecosystem. So also that connection back to the fact that, like, these are huge food producing regenerative systems that we need to be protecting more.